Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be a video walkthrough of the rib cage, including the sternum, the clavicles, and at the end we will also look at the hyoid bone. So first, what we see here on the left, this is a very zoomed in image on the rib cage, but in this view, really what we're wanting to pay attention to is right here in the middle, the sternum. This is the hard bone in the middle of your chest. When you tap the middle of your chest and you feel that hard bone, that is your sternum. Over here on the right, we have an isolated sternum with some of the costal cartilage, the rib cartilage, attached to it. Now, in lab, we do have some isolated sternum that do not have anything attached to them, but I do not have images of those. But let's go ahead and look to see what all is going on with the sternum and what you need to know about it. So let's begin over here on the left. If we look closely, we can see that there are a few lines in the sternum, and those lines will help us separate the sternum into the three major components. Now, up at the top of this image, this part right here is called the manubrium. The manubrium. Now, manubrium is a word that translates into handle. Manubrium means handle, and we'll see why that is in just a moment. This middle part, the longer part, is called the body of the sternum. Some sources you may see it called the blade of the sternum, but body is more common. And then down at the bottom, there's this small little triangular area that's called the xiphoid process. And now if you trace all the way down your sternum to where it ends, there's that point that's a little bit flexible, kind of uncomfortable to press on very hard. That is this xiphoid process. And xipho is a root word that means sword. Sword. And oid, remember, oid at the end of a word always means resembles. So let's go back to look at the entire thing. The handle, the manubrium, the body or the blade, and the xiphoid or sword resembling portion. So when we look at the sternum, it kind of looks like a knife or a dagger or a sword pointing downward with the handle up, and that's how it got its name. It resembled a knife, it resembled a sword. So manubrium, body, xiphoid process are the three major components of a sternum. Now, if we look up here at the manubrium, there are some other markings that we need to know. And on either side, there's this kind of small indentation. And in this image, we can see a little bit of the collarbones, the clavicles, resting against those indentations. Now you can feel these at the base of your neck. And this is where the clavicles, the collarbones, meet with or articulate with the manubrium of the sternum. These small indentations are called the clavicular notches. There's a clavicular notch on each side. And in between, there's another indentation that does not have an articulation, that does not have another bone joining it. And that has a couple of different names. Sometimes you will hear it called the jugular notch, which I believe is what our lab manual says. But more commonly, we will see it called the suprasternal notch. Suprasternal. That just means at the top of the sternum or above the sternum. So let's go over here on the right and see those same things on this other sternum. Let's start from the bottom. Here's that xiphoid process. Here's the body of the sternum and the manubrium. We can also see each clavicular notch and the jugular notch, or the suprasternal notch. All right, now so we're looking at the upper part of the chest, the lower part of the neck, and there's a lot that we can see in this image, but really what we're going to be looking at now are the collarbones, which are called the clavicles. Here we can see the clavicle and the other clavicle. So we're facing this person, so this is the right clavicle and the left clavicle. Now, you do not need to know right and left clavicle for this class. There's a lot of bones that you do need to know left or right. You do not need to know the left and right of the clavicle. I'm just pointing it out here for orientation purposes. Now let's go back to what we were just looking at. Here's that manubrium of the sternum. Here's that jugular notch or the suprasternal notch. And on each side here we see our clavicular notches. And remember, that's where the clavicle articulates with the sternum. So this end of the clavicle that sets on the sternum, this end is called the sternal end of the clavicle, the sternal end. Now, if we had one of these in front of us, we would be able to see that this end is very blunt. It's very blunt. Now, if we look at the other end of the sternum, it's very flat. If you were to pinch the top and bottom right here, it's very, very flat, and it forms kind of a hook. You can see that it's arched a little bit. This end is actually what attaches to your scapula, your shoulder blade. Now, this end that attaches to the scapula is called the acromial end. Now, let's see why it's got that name. Remember when we were learning our surface terminology? The shoulder, that point of the shoulder, was called the acromial region. And when we watch the video for the scapula, the shoulder blade, this little projection that's sticking forward right here is called the acromial process. So the end of the clavicle that bumps up against, that articulates with the acromial process in the acromial region, this is called the acromial end of the clavicle. So really, you just need to know clavicle is the bone. We have the sternal end and the acromial end. Same thing over here. Here we have the clavicle, the sternal end, and the acromial end. Nothing really new in this view. It's just off to the side a little bit so that you can see what I meant by it's very blunt on the sternal end of the clavicle, and the acromial end of the clavicle is very flat and it hooks. It's bent. It's got an arch. And here is that acromial process that I was talking about coming off of the scapula. And when you see that video, you will look more at this acromial process. Now here what we've done is isolated a rib, and we're looking at one rib by itself so that we can see the parts of this rib that we need to know. Now when we look at a rib, one end of it doesn't really seem to have much going on at all. The other end has a little bit of a swollen spot right there and a little bit of a swollen spot along the shaft up just a little bit. Now, the end that doesn't really have a lot going on, that's called the anterior end. The anterior end. And this is the part that actually connects to that cartilage facing the sternum. Now on the other side, This small little bump right here along the shaft is called the tubercle. The tubercle. And this is called the head. Now, the head and the tubercle are near this bent portion of the rib. So that can help orient you. And this is actually towards the back. This is the posterior side of the rib. Now, this part, the anterior end, like I said, connects to cartilage, which then connects to the sternum. As we saw in that previous image of the rib cage, the front part of your ribs, the anterior part closest to your sternum, that's not bone, that's cartilage called costal cartilage. Costal just means related to the ribs. And now what I've done here is nothing that you need to know. This is just to kind of orient you, since we don't have a skeleton that we can, approach in the lab, since we're doing this by video. But what we see here, if you've already watched the video on the vertebrae, you know that this is a thoracic vertebrae. And the thoracic vertebrae, by definition, are what a pair of ribs attach to. Now, when we look at a rib and how it connects to a thoracic vertebrae, that articulation, this little guy right here, the tubercle, actually rests against this area right here, the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. And this part, the head of the rib, actually rests against this flat area right here on the side of the body of this vertebrae. So we can just kind of, in our heads, slide this over, and it would actually fit right through here. And then the rib would come around, and the sternum would be up in this area right in here. So now let's look at how the ribs actually articulate with the sternum a little bit closer. And all ribs don't connect to the sternum the same way, and as a matter of fact, some ribs don't connect to the sternum at all. Now, over on the right, here we can see that image from the sternum with the costal cartilage attached. This is what was on that first slide that we saw. And over here on the left, here is a view from the front, from the anterior of the rib cage. Here we're looking at one from the right side, and here we're looking at one from the back, from the posterior. Now, when we look at the ribs, some of them, if we look at these first 7 ribs, the first 7 ribs will actually connect to some costal cartilage, and then that costal cartilage continues and connects to the sternum. So it goes rib, costal cartilage, sternum. Here's the next rib, costal cartilage, sternum. And the first 7 ribs do that. So let's, over here on the right on this sternum image, let's count down. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And all of those, the rib connects to the costal cartilage, and the costal cartilage continues on and connects to the sternum. The rib comes along, connects to the costal cartilage, and continues on to connect to the sternum. Now the next 3 ribs, if we look at 1, 2, 3, you can see these, when the rib connects to the costal cartilage then merges, and one kind of collection of that costal cartilage continues on to connect to the sternum. So the first 7 ribs connect to the costal cartilage and then onto the sternum. The next 3 ribs connect to the costal cartilage. Those 3 sets of costal cartilage merge before continuing on to the sternum. Those 3 ribs are called false ribs. And we can see over here in this image, here's those 3 that connect to each other before continuing on to the sternum. But in this image here, we can see there are 2 sets of ribs. A little harder to see from the back because of the way the image looks. And again, right here on the side, the bottom 2 sets of ribs do not connect to the sternum at all. There is no costal cartilage associated with the bottom 2 pairs of ribs, and the bottom 2 pairs of ribs are isolated. They do not connect to the sternum at all. Those 2 ribs, or those 2 pairs of ribs, are called floating ribs. But just to make it a little more complicated, floating ribs are also false ribs. So let's real quick write this out. We have 7 pairs of true ribs. We have 3 just straight false ribs, and 2 pairs of floating ribs that are also false. So we combine those, and really we say there are 5 pairs of false ribs. 2 of them just happen to also be floating. So how many pairs of ribs are there? Well, 7 plus 5 gives us 12 pairs of ribs. 24 ribs total, 12 pairs. Now, is that for a male or is that for a female? Well, it's an old wives' tale. It's actually not true that men and women have different numbers of ribs. Men and women both have 12 pairs of ribs. And how can you keep that straight? Well, what was the definition of a thoracic vertebrae? It had a pair of ribs attached to it. How many thoracic vertebrae were there? There were 12. So, same number of thoracic vertebrae as pairs of ribs. Now moving away from the rib cage entirely, let's look at another bone that really is one of my favorite bones in the body. This is called the hyoid bone. And the hyoid bone is unique in that it is the only bone in the body that does not articulate with or connect to another bone. The hyoid bone is completely separate from all of the other bones in your body. And it's found just below your jaw in your neck, right at the top of your larynx, your voice box, your Adam's apple. And this bone, it just looks really neat. You do not need to know any of the markings on this. All you need to know is that this is a hyoid bone. But I do want to go ahead and point out some features. These back ends are called the greater horn, and these little things that stick up that look like vampire teeth are called lesser horns. Now, you do not need to know either greater horn or lesser horn. That's just to kind of point out some neat features here. Now, not only is this the only bone that doesn't connect with or articulate with another bone, it's also of interest for forensics. Now, when someone has been strangled, oftentimes that will break the hyoid bone. And when someone is conducting a murder investigation and they suspect that someone has been strangled, then they will look to see, has the hyoid bone been broken? Now here it looks like at first another hyoid bone, but it is not. When we look at this, we still see what looks like those greater horns. We see these little points that look like those lesser horns. But this is not a hyoid bone. It's the same size. It's pretty much the same shape. It has pretty much the same features. But let's see what this bone actually is. That bone is actually the mandible of a baby, the lower jaw of a baby. So over on the right, we see an adult mandible. Over here on the left is a baby's mandible. And what we're seeing back here, those are those mandibular condyles. And these little points are the coronoid processes. So it looks a lot like a hyoid bone, but it's actually a mandible from a baby. And the way to differentiate is just look at those little things that I called vampire teeth earlier. On a hyoid bone, they're in the front, where we would expect to find vampire teeth. On a baby's mandible, they're in the back because they are actually coronoid processes. And here we can see the baby's mandible by itself and attached to the full baby skull. All right, so that's everything for this video. Be sure to check out the others and let me know if you have any questions.